Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion before us is a straightforward one, and I note the Solicitor General's remarks that he did not want to be here. But I think the more pertinent point, Mr. Speaker, is that we should not have found ourselves here. When Parliament overwhelmingly voted to give the Prime Minister the authority to trigger Article 50 and begin the negotiations, we never expected we would be in this position 2 years later. The government should be mortified, frankly, that they've been forced to ask once again for this House's approval to seek an extension to the Article 50 process. Not only because the fact that another extension is required is itself a damning indictment of this government's mishandling of the negotiations and its failure to secure a deal that could command the confidence of the Commons, but also because the very fact that we're being asked to approve the motion before us, pursuant to an unconventional Act of Parliament spearheaded by my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, and the right honourable gentleman, the member for Dorset West, and passed last week in the face of government opposition, is testament to the very serious erosion of trust between the executive and this legislature. If honourable and right honourable members are weary, Mr. Speaker, it's first and foremost a weariness of the undeliverable promises made by this government and the false expectations that have consistently been raised, whether it be the Brady Amendment or the Malthouse Compromise. Even this morning, contrary to all the available evidence and the constancy of the EU position, the Leader of the House chose to give credence to the fantastical notion that the EU, at the same time as considering another extension request, might also entirely shift their position and agree to reopen the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, it's long past time that government ministers stop peddling myths to indulge the hardliners on their own benches and advance their personal agendas. To that end, I'd welcome confirmation. Happy to give way to Mike.
Well, that man will be giving way on this point, and does he agree with me that a longer extension to get this right without having these cliff edges would be preferable? And has he noticed that the ERG on the other side are doing their best to stymie a long extension by threatening the EU that the UK will cause havoc in the EU institutions if there is such a long extension? Will he take this opportunity to condemn absolutely that view and that method of working?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. I think she makes a very good point. Members on the opposite benches want to tell us that throughout the duration of our membership of the Union we've had no influence whatsoever, but that if we stay in we'd be able to exert that influence in a way that would be wholly irresponsible for the functioning of the Union. I'll give way one more time.
I to the honourable gentleman for giving way. This is a genuine question. I actually think that if there had been an amendment tabled by Her Majesty's opposition seeking a much longer extension, it would have won certainly the support of most of us sitting over in this quarter. And I just wondered if there was a reason why the opposition didn't table that amendment and make sure we get the long extension, which certainly would do the job for manufacturers in particular.
I thank the honourable lady for that point. I think the honest answer is we all know that the 30th of June is not a particularly realistic proposition, and that the Prime Minister was forced to propose that date more for the reasons of party management than what the EU... And she has, in a sense, contracted out the decision to the EU, and we would expect the government to accept any reasonable extension that goes beyond the 30th of June, with the proviso that if this House approved and ratified a withdrawal agreement, we would exit at that point. I'll give way one last time and then I'm going to...
Would you just also take this opportunity to reassure our European partners, some of whom may feel nervous about granting us or asking for a long extension because of the threats made by the ERG, that our own Prime Minister in this country has finally stopped kowtowing to the ERG, apparently. So the European Union doesn't need to start kowtowing to them too.
I entirely agree with my honourable friend. Mr. Speaker, events have clearly overtaken us since the EU Withdrawal Act 2019 was first conceived, with the Prime Minister having already written to the President of the European Council indicating her intention to seek an extension until the 30th of June. As I said, we wholeheartedly support the government's efforts to secure one. Indeed, it's vital if we're to avoid a disastrous no deal. And as I said, we would expect the government to agree to any reasonable extension beyond the 30th of June. And if that is the case, the opposition would support accepting that proposition. But as we've argued consistently, Mr. Speaker, any extension must be for a worthwhile purpose, and the length of the extension must flow from that purpose. The public will not forgive the government if an extension is sought and agreed under the pretence of efforts to secure cross-party compromise, simply for ministers then to use the time secured in a vain attempt to find a way to force this House to accept the same flawed deal that has been voted down on 3 occasions. I'm going to give way one final time because I know there are many people.
Well, I thank the honourable member for making the right decision to give way.
Get on with it.
Isn't it about time that we accepted that the strategy that the Prime Minister has pursued up until now is a failed strategy, that there is no majority in this House for that deal, and that being pressured at the last minute to cobble something together which is divisive to this House is not the right approach either, given how irreversible and momentous the decision in front of us is. In that case, we should embrace the opportunity of a longer extension to pause and reflect to get the right deal for our country.
Far too long.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention. I agree with him entirely. It is a failed strategy, and as I'll come on to say, I think that for any viable proposition to be accepted, there has to be real movement from the government. And it's on that basis that the opposition agreed to substantive talks with the government in the national interest. As you'll be aware, sir, a further round of talks is taking place as we speak, and we will continue to engage with them in a constructive spirit. But the talks will inevitably fail if the government is not willing to countenance fundamental changes to its deal. It's futile and frankly patronising, Mr Speaker, to honourable and right honourable members across the House to be told that if we only understood the government's deal properly, we'd realise that the concerns we've expressed to this day are unwarranted. If a stable majority is to coalesce around a single unified approach, it will require, as the Solicitor General said, real compromise. It will also require honesty from the government about where legitimate differences exist, how they might be bridged in an overhauled political declaration, how this House would entrench any changes that might be agreed, so they can't simply be ripped up by whichever of the expanding field of candidates eventually succeeds the Prime Minister, and the requirement for seeking public approval for any agreement that might emerge at this late hour by means of a confirmatory referendum. And finally, Mr Speaker, honesty is also required. I'm not going to give way any further, thank you. But finally, Mr Speaker, honesty is also required about the obligations that any extension beyond the 22nd of May might entail. That includes being honest with ourselves and the public about participation in the European Parliament elections, abiding by any duty of sincere cooperation and any other reasonable conditions that the EU might set. Mr Speaker, there is no question that the House should approve the motion before us so that we can secure the necessary extension to the Article 50 process. We must then use that extension, not to prolong the misery of recent months, but to recalibrate and forge a different way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr.